The silence in the briefing room was deafening. 27 Navy SEALs, men who had stared death in the face across 3 continents, sat motionless as the projector screen flickered to life. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. The grainy infrared footage showed a single F-16 fighting Falcon threading between 2 enemy surface-to-air missile sites, executing a maneuver that military analysts would later call impossible. The aircraft rolled inverted at barely 200 feet, its afterburners painting white-hot streaks across the night vision display, before delivering a precision strike that eliminated both targets in a synchronized explosion that lit up the desert like twin suns. But it wasn't the tactical brilliance that stunned them into silence. It wasn't even the fact that this pilot had saved their entire extraction team from certain annihilation just 18 hours earlier. It was the call sign painted in faded yellow letters beneath the cockpit: Raven 7, a designation that had become legend in special operations circles, whispered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the dead. The pilot they'd been tracking for 3 years through classified after-action reports and sanitized mission summaries wasn't the grizzled veteran they'd imagined. She was a 34-year-old woman who stood barely 5'4" in her flight suit, with calloused hands that spoke of countless hours gripping a control stick and eyes that held the quiet confidence of someone who had looked into the abyss and emerged victorious. The story of how Lieutenant Commander Kira Raven Delacroix earned the salute of America's most elite warriors began 8 years earlier in the humid hell of Naval Air Station Pensacola, where a 2-star general named Marcus Thornfield made the mistake that would haunt his career. The mistake wasn't tactical or strategic, it was personal. He looked at the slight figure in the oversized flight suit during her first day of advanced fighter training and saw not potential, but problems. Not excellence, but exceptions. Not a future ace, but a liability wrapped in regulations and political correctness. "This isn't a daycare, Cadet Delacroix," Thornfield had sneered, his voice carrying across the tarmac as the other trainees pretended not to listen. "The Navy doesn't need pilots who require step stools to reach the rudder pedals." The laughter that followed was nervous, uncertain, but loud enough to echo off the hangar walls, loud enough to brand itself into Kira's memory like a scar. Loud enough to fuel 8 years of relentless determination that would reshape the very definition of what it meant to be a warrior in the modern age. None of them could have predicted that this moment, this casual cruelty disguised as military tradition, would forge the most feared pilot in 3 theaters of war. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in the simulator rooms at 500 hours, when the base was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, and the only sounds were the hum of cooling fans and the soft click of switches being tested again and again. While her classmates slept off their weekend liberty, Kira ran through emergency scenarios until her responses became automatic, until she could identify engine failure by the subtle change in vibration frequency, until she could calculate intercept vectors in her head faster than the onboard computer could display them. Her instructor, a weathered Navy commander named James "Ghost" Morrison, noticed the difference after 3 weeks. Morrison had trained fighter pilots for 15 years, had seen the cocky washouts and the natural talents, the ones who peaked early and the late bloomers who surprised everyone. But he'd never seen anyone who approached flying with the methodical precision of an engineer and the intuitive grace of an artist. Delacroix didn't just learn maneuvers. She dissected them, understood them at a molecular level, then rebuilt them better than they'd been designed. "You're not trying to prove them wrong," Morrison observed one evening as they reviewed her performance metrics. The numbers were impressive: reaction times in the 95th percentile, weapons accuracy that bordered on supernatural, and a situational awareness score that had never been achieved by a first-year student. "You're trying to prove something else entirely." Kira looked up from the flight manual she'd been studying, her eyes reflecting the green glow of the computer screen. "I'm trying to prove that when someone's life depends on my decisions, their gender won't matter. Their politics won't matter. Their opinions about women in combat won't matter. The only thing that will matter is whether I can bring them home alive." Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing something in her voice that he'd heard before in the best pilots, the ones who understood that flying fighters wasn't about glory or ego, but about responsibility measured in human lives. He'd seen that quality in exactly 7 pilots during his career. 6 of them were dead, killed in combat or training accidents that turned heroes into memories. The 7th was sitting across from him, annotating aerodynamic equations with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. The mockery continued through her first year, subtle but persistent. Thornfield made sure of it, his influence spreading through the training program like poison in groundwater. Instructors questioned her decisions a beat longer than necessary. Fellow trainees excluded her from study groups and social gatherings. Maintenance crews made jokes about installing booster seats in her aircraft. But with each slight, each dismissive comment, each assumption about her limitations, Kira's resolve crystallized into something harder than titanium and sharper than radar-guided ordnance. The turning point came during her final evaluation exercise, a simulated combat scenario designed to test everything she'd learned about air-to-air combat, ground attack missions, and emergency procedures. The parameters were brutal, outnumbered 4-to-1 against experienced pilot instructors, operating in hostile airspace with limited fuel, and a communications system programmed to fail at the worst possible moment. 90% of trainees failed this exercise. Most were satisfied with a respectable showing that demonstrated competence without embarrassment. Kira didn't aim for respectability, she aimed for perfection. The exercise began at dawn, with 4 F-16s launching from different vectors to simulate a coordinated enemy attack on her solo aircraft. The rules of engagement were simple: survive 15 minutes, score at least 1 simulated kill, and return to base with enough fuel for a safe landing. Standard doctrine called for defensive maneuvering, using terrain and altitude to avoid engagement until the enemy exhausted their ammunition or fuel. It was a survival test, not a combat demonstration. But Kira had studied the biographies of every ace in military history, from Eddie Rickenbacker to Robin Olds, and she understood something that most pilots never grasped. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your enemy expects. As the 4 aggressor aircraft converged on her position, she did something that defied every principle of defensive flying. She turned directly toward them and accelerated to maximum military power, transforming herself from prey into predator in a heartbeat that registered on every radar screen within 50 miles. What happened next would be analyzed in military academies for the next decade. Using a combination of vertical maneuvering, energy management, and pure spatial awareness, Kira engaged all 4 instructors simultaneously, using their own formations against them, forcing them into mutual interference patterns that rendered their numerical advantage meaningless. Within 8 minutes, she had scored simulated kills on 3 of the 4 aircraft, and damaged the 4th so severely that it would have been forced to withdraw from any real combat scenario. But the demonstration wasn't over. With 7 minutes remaining in the exercise, she executed a series of low-altitude maneuvers that showcased every aspect of precision flying: terrain-following navigation at dangerous speeds, simulated weapons delivery with surgical accuracy, and defensive countermeasures that turned incoming missile locks into opportunities for counterattack. When she finally landed, her fuel gauges showed exactly the minimum required reserves, not a drop more, not a drop less. General Thornfield watched the replay footage 3 times before he spoke. The briefing room was packed with instructors, evaluators, and senior officers who had come to witness what many expected to be a spectacular failure. Instead, they had observed something that redefined their understanding of what was possible in a single-seat fighter aircraft. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the mechanical whir of cooling systems and the distant sound of aircraft operations on the flight line. "Cadet Delacroix," Thornfield finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "That was—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't compromise his authority while acknowledging what everyone in the room had witnessed. "Unorthodox." Kira stood at attention, her expression revealing nothing of the adrenaline that still coursed through her system. "Sir, unorthodox situations require unorthodox solutions. In combat, the enemy doesn't care about our training manuals or our standard operating procedures. They care about killing us before we can complete our mission. My job isn't to follow doctrine perfectly. It's to adapt doctrine to ensure mission success and crew survival." The room remained silent as Thornfield processed this response. He had expected humility, perhaps even an apology for showboating. Instead, he found himself facing a pilot who understood warfare at a level that most officers never achieved, even after decades of service. The realization was disturbing, not because of what it revealed about Delacroix, but because of what it revealed about his own assumptions and prejudices. Morrison stepped forward, his weathered features betraying nothing of the pride he felt. "Sir, Cadet Delacroix's performance parameters exceeded established benchmarks in every category. Reaction time, accuracy, fuel management, tactical decision-making, and situational awareness all scored in the 99th percentile. Additionally, her post-mission brief demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the strategic implications of her tactical choices." Thornfield nodded, his jaw tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Recommendations." "Immediate advancement to operational training, sir, with a strong recommendation for assignment to a frontline squadron upon graduation." Morrison paused, then added quietly, "Sir, in 15 years of training fighter pilots, I've never seen natural ability at this level combined with this degree of tactical sophistication. Cadet Delacroix isn't just ready for combat, she's ready to rewrite the manual on how combat is conducted." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone present to question the assessment. No one did. Even Thornfield, for all his reservations about women in combat roles, couldn't argue with performance data that spoke louder than his personal opinions. But as he looked at the slight figure standing before him, he felt a cold certainty that this moment would have consequences he couldn't predict or control. He was right. The assignment came 6 months later. VFA 143, Pukin Dogs, an F-16 squadron based at Shaw Air Force Base with a reputation for aggressive tactics and tight unit cohesion. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Viper Chen, had specifically requested Delacroix based on her training records and Morrison's recommendation. It was the kind of assignment that most new pilots dreamed of: operational fighters, experienced colleagues, and the opportunity to prove themselves in real-world missions. But dreams and reality rarely aligned in military aviation, and Kira's arrival at Shaw was met with the kind of reception she had learned to expect: polite professionalism masking barely concealed skepticism. The squadron's 12 pilots were all combat veterans with multiple deployments, men who had earned their call signs through fire and blood, and the kind of brotherhood that only forms when people trust each other with their lives on a daily basis. They weren't hostile to the idea of a female pilot. They were suspicious of any newcomer who might disrupt the delicate chemistry that kept them alive in hostile airspace. The suspicion deepened when they learned about her training performance. Exceptional scores weren't necessarily an indicator of combat effectiveness, and the history of military aviation was littered with hotshot pilots who had excelled in controlled environments but cracked under the pressure of real combat. The squadron had lost 2 pilots in the previous year, one to enemy action, one to a training accident that might have been prevented by better judgment, and they weren't interested in gambling with untested talent. Kira understood their caution because she shared it. She had studied the unit's combat history, analyzed their tactics, and memorized the names and service records of every pilot they'd lost in the previous 5 years. She knew that acceptance couldn't be demanded or legislated. It had to be earned through consistent performance under progressively challenging conditions. The process would take time, patience, and the kind of flawless execution that left no room for doubt or second-guessing. Her first operational mission was a routine patrol over international waters, the kind of assignment designed to ease new pilots into the rhythm of squadron operations without exposing them to significant risk. She flew wing position to Chen, following standard protocols and maintaining perfect formation discipline while familiarizing herself with the aircraft's systems and the unit's communication procedures. The mission lasted 4 hours and was completely uneventful, exactly as planned. But even routine missions provided opportunities for observation and evaluation, and Chen watched her new pilot with the focused attention of a commander responsible for lives she couldn't afford to lose. What she saw was promising. Smooth control inputs, precise navigation, and radio discipline that suggested professional maturity beyond Delacroix's chronological age. More importantly, she noticed how the young pilot's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the horizon, checking instruments, and monitoring the positions of other aircraft with the hypervigilance that separated survivors from statistics. After landing, Chen pulled Kira aside for a private debrief, standard procedure for first missions, but also an opportunity to assess the pilot's attitude and mindset. They walked to a quiet corner of the squadron-ready room, away from the casual conversations and routine paperwork that filled the spaces between missions. "How do you feel about the flight?" Chen asked, settling into one of the worn leather chairs that had witnessed countless similar conversations over the years. Kira considered the question carefully, recognizing it as both evaluation and invitation. "Technically proficient but operationally limited, ma'am. I executed the assigned profile successfully, but I spent too much mental bandwidth on basic aircraft familiarization and not enough on tactical awareness. In a contested environment, that focus imbalance could be fatal for me and for anyone depending on my support." Chen nodded, impressed despite herself by the honesty and self-awareness. Most new pilots either minimized their limitations or overcorrected with false bravado. Delacroix's assessment was clinically accurate and demonstrated the kind of professional introspection that characterized the best combat aviators. Recommendations for improvement: more flight time in this specific airframe, ma'am. Additional simulator work focusing on emergency procedures until they become automatic. And Kira paused, knowing that her next words would reveal her understanding of squadron dynamics and her commitment to earning her place among them. Integration with squadron tactical doctrine through joint training exercises. I need to learn how this unit fights as a team, not just how I fight as an individual. The response told Chen everything she needed to know about her new pilot's priorities and professional maturity. The mention of team integration was particularly significant. It demonstrated that Delacroix understood that individual excellence meant nothing if it couldn't be integrated into collective effectiveness. It was the perspective of someone who thought like a combat leader, not just a skilled aviator. Over the following months, Kira threw herself into the demanding routine of operational squadron life with the same methodical intensity she had applied to flight training. She arrived early and stayed late, studying mission profiles and tactical procedures until she could recite them from memory. She volunteered for additional training opportunities and sought out the most experienced pilots for informal mentoring sessions. She learned to maintain her aircraft systems, not because it was required, but because she believed that understanding her equipment at the deepest level would make her more effective in crisis situations. The squadron's acceptance came gradually, measured in small moments of inclusion and professional respect, an invitation to join a discussion about tactical modifications, a request for input on mission planning, the casual use of her call sign, Raven, instead of her formal rank and surname. These incremental acknowledgments of belonging meant more to Kira than any formal recognition, because they represented something that couldn't be commanded or legislated. The trust of professionals who had chosen to include her in their exclusive brotherhood. The call sign itself had emerged naturally from her flying style and tactical approach. During training exercises, she had demonstrated an uncanny ability to appear without warning in advantageous positions, striking with precision before melting back into the digital landscape like smoke. The name suggested both intelligence and predatory instinct, qualities that her squadron mates had come to associate with her approach to aerial combat. It was a mark of respect disguised as casual nickname, and Kira wore it with quiet pride. But respect earned in training is different from respect earned in combat, and the true test of her capabilities came 9 months later when the squadron received deployment orders to a classified location in the Middle East. The mission briefing was deliberately vague: close air support for special operations forces conducting counterterrorism activities in a region where American involvement was politically sensitive. The kind of assignment that required tactical flexibility, split-second decision-making, and the ability to operate effectively with minimal support or oversight. The deployment facility was austere even by military standards, a remote airstrip carved from desert sand, surrounded by prefabricated buildings that provided basic accommodation and maintenance facilities. Security was tight, communications were limited, and the isolation was complete. It was the kind of environment that revealed character through the accumulated stress of dangerous work performed under primitive conditions, where small personality conflicts could escalate into unit-threatening crises. Kira adapted to the harsh conditions with the same systematic approach she applied to every challenge. She established routines that maintained physical fitness and mental sharpness despite the oppressive heat and limited recreational opportunities. She volunteered for extra duties that benefited the entire unit, from maintenance support to communications watch. She learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of a deployed squadron, where professional relationships were intensified by isolation and shared danger. Most importantly, she continued to fly with the precision and tactical awareness that had earned her place in the squadron. The missions were varied and unpredictable: reconnaissance flights over suspected terrorist installations, close air support for ground forces engaged in direct combat, and interdiction strikes against weapons smuggling routes. Each sortie added to her experience base and reinforced her reputation as a pilot who could be trusted with increasingly challenging assignments. The mission that changed everything came on a night when the desert air was thick with sandstorm debris, and the visibility was reduced to mere hundreds of meters. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a terrorist leader responsible for orchestrating attacks against coalition forces, in a compound near the border with a neighboring country. The window for interdiction was narrow. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity, suggesting the target would relocate within hours, possibly to a location where American forces couldn't legally engage. The mission parameters were complex and dangerous. The target was located in a densely populated area where collateral damage would have serious diplomatic consequences. The compound was defended by surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery that posed significant threats to approaching aircraft. Weather conditions would make navigation difficult and target identification challenging. Most problematically, the mission would require coordination with a team of Navy SEALs who were conducting a simultaneous ground operation in the same area. Kira was assigned as the primary attack aircraft, with 2 other squadron pilots providing cover and backup. The mission commander was Chen, flying in a support role that allowed her to coordinate between air and ground elements while maintaining overall tactical control. It was the kind of high-stakes, multi-element operation that could establish or destroy military careers depending on its outcome. The brief was thorough but sobering. The target compound was a three-story building surrounded by civilian structures, requiring precision weapons delivery that would neutralize the threat without harming innocent people. The SEAL team would approach from the north, using the cover of the sandstorm to reach their insertion point undetected. Air support would come from the south, flying low to avoid radar detection while maintaining enough altitude for effective weapons employment. Timing was critical. The airstrike had to be coordinated with the ground assault to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk to the Special Operations team. Communications would be limited by weather conditions and the need to maintain operational security. If something went wrong, the pilots would have to make tactical decisions without complete information, balancing mission objectives against force protection requirements. As they walked to their aircraft, Chen pulled Kira aside for a final word. The older pilot's expression was serious, reflecting the weight of responsibility that came with leading complex combat operations. Raven, this is the kind of mission that defines careers. Success requires perfect execution under impossible conditions. I'm putting you in the primary position because I believe you can handle the pressure, but I need you to understand what's at stake. Kira nodded, her expression calm despite the adrenaline beginning to build in her system. Ma'am, I understand the tactical requirements and the political implications. More importantly, I understand that people are counting on us to perform flawlessly when failure isn't an option. That's exactly the kind of challenge I've been preparing for since the first day of flight training. Chen studied her pilot's face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What she found was the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, not this specific mission, but the broader challenge of proving herself worthy of the trust placed in her. Good. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to do what needs to be done despite that fear. Tonight, you're going to discover exactly how much courage you have. The flight to the target area was tense and uneventful, 4 aircraft maintaining strict radio silence while navigating through weather conditions that turned routine procedures into complex challenges. Kira flew with mechanical precision, cross-referencing GPS coordinates with terrain features while monitoring her instruments for any sign of system malfunction. The sandstorm reduced visibility to less than a mile, transforming familiar territory into an alien landscape where navigation errors could have catastrophic consequences. As they approached the target area, communications crackled with updates from the ground team. The SEALs had reached their insertion point without detection and were moving toward the compound under cover of the weather. Intelligence updates confirmed that the high-value target was still present, but also revealed additional defensive measures that hadn't appeared in the original briefing. The mission was proceeding according to plan, but with added complexities that would test every aspect of their training and experience. Then everything went wrong in the span of 30 seconds that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. The SEAL team's approach was detected by sentries who had been positioned outside the compound's perimeter, triggering an immediate alarm that brought the entire facility to full alert status. Surface-to-air missiles began tracking the approaching aircraft, their radar signatures appearing on threat warning displays like deadly flowers blooming in the electronic darkness. Enemy fighters scrambled from a nearby airfield, vectoring toward the American formation with hostile intent clearly indicated by their flight profiles. Most critically, the ground team found themselves pinned down by heavy weapons fire in a position that offered minimal cover and no viable escape routes. Their only chance of survival depended on immediate and accurate close air support that could suppress enemy fire without endangering American forces operating in extremely close proximity to hostile positions. The tactical picture evolved from complex to impossible in the time it takes to draw 3 breaths. Kira found herself flying a precision attack mission against multiple targets while dodging surface-to-air missiles, coordinating with ground forces engaged in direct combat, and preparing to engage enemy fighters that were rapidly closing on her position. The weather conditions that had provided initial concealment now became obstacles to target identification and weapons delivery accuracy. Standard doctrine called for aborting the mission and withdrawing to safety, preserving aircraft and aircrews for future operations, rather than risking valuable assets in a deteriorating tactical situation. But the voices on the radio told a different story. American Special Operations Forces were dying on the ground, and withdrawal meant abandoning them to certain death or capture. The choice between doctrine and duty crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity that would define everything that followed. Kira made her decision in the time between heartbeats, her voice cutting through the static and confusion with calm authority that surprised even her squadron mates. "Viper Leader, this is Raven 7. I'm going in. Recommend you provide top cover and coordinate extraction for the ground team. I'll handle the close air support mission." Chen's response was immediate and sharp. "Negative, Raven 7. The tactical situation is too dangerous for single aircraft operations. We maintain formation and execute withdrawal protocols." But Kira was already banking toward the target, her aircraft disappearing into the swirling sand and darkness like a ghost materializing from the storm. Her voice came back over the radio with the kind of certainty that couldn't be argued with or countermanded. "Ma'am, those SEALs don't have time for committee decisions. I'm the best precision pilot in this formation, and I'm the only one positioned for immediate weapons employment. Trust me to do my job." What happened next would become the stuff of military legend, analyzed in staff colleges and aviation schools as an example of individual initiative transcending established doctrine to achieve mission success. Flying at altitudes that brought her within range of small arms fire, Kira began a series of attack runs that required superhuman precision and split-second timing. Using a combination of terrain masking, electronic countermeasures, and pure piloting skill, she systematically eliminated the defensive positions that were pinning down the SEAL team while avoiding the civilian structures that surrounded the compound. The first pass silenced 2 machine gun positions with 20 cannon fire delivered with surgical precision. The second pass destroyed a mortar team that had been bracketing the Americans' position with increasingly accurate fire. The third pass eliminated the surface-to-air missile site that had been tracking her aircraft, removing the primary threat to the other members of her formation. Each attack required her to fly through concentrated defensive fire, while maintaining the kind of accuracy that left no margin for error. But the most challenging target remained. The building where the high-value target had taken refuge, now surrounded by human shields and defended by fighters who knew that their lives depended on preventing American success. The structure was located in the center of the compound, protected by overlapping fields of fire, and close enough to civilian buildings that any miscalculation could result in unacceptable collateral damage. The solution required a level of tactical innovation that transcended normal mission parameters. Instead of approaching from a predictable direction, Kira used the terrain and weather conditions to mask her approach until she was directly overhead the target building. Then, in a maneuver that violated every principle of safe flying, she rolled inverted and dove toward the structure at an angle so steep that her aircraft was essentially falling out of the sky, with its engines providing just enough thrust to maintain control. The weapon's release occurred at the last possible second, with Kira pulling out of the dive so close to the ground that her wingtips nearly clipped the surrounding buildings. The precision-guided munition struck the target structure with devastating accuracy, eliminating the terrorist leader and his key associates while leaving the adjacent civilian buildings untouched. The explosion lit up the compound like daybreak, temporarily overwhelming night vision equipment and creating a pillar of fire that rose toward the storm clouds above. But Kira wasn't finished. As she climbed away from the target area, her threat warning system detected the approach of enemy fighters vectoring toward the compound at maximum speed. The SEAL team was still exposed and vulnerable, requiring continued air cover until they could reach their extraction point. Her fuel was running low, her ammunition was nearly exhausted, and she was facing multiple enemy aircraft with superior numbers and home field advantage. The engagement that followed would be studied by fighter pilots for decades as an example of tactical brilliance overcoming overwhelming odds. Using energy management, situational awareness, and weapons employment techniques that pushed her aircraft and herself to absolute limits, Kira engaged 4 enemy fighters simultaneously while continuing to provide close air support for the ground team. The combat was three-dimensional chess played at supersonic speeds, where every decision had life-or-death consequences, and there was no time for second-guessing or hesitation. One by one, the enemy aircraft fell to her guns and missiles, until the night sky was clear of hostile contacts and the SEAL team was safely aboard their extraction helicopters. When she finally turned toward home base, her fuel gauges showed levels that would require immediate landing at the nearest available airfield. She had pushed every system to its maximum capability and succeeded in a mission that military analysts would later describe as impossible for a single pilot operating without support. The landing was routine compared to what had preceded it, but as Kira taxied toward the parking area, she could see the entire squadron waiting for her. The sight was unprecedented. Pilots, maintenance crews, and support personnel standing in the blazing desert heat to welcome home an aircraft and aviator who had redefined what it meant to excel in combat. The silence that greeted her as she shut down the engines was more profound than any applause could have been. Chen was the first to reach her aircraft, climbing the ladder to help Kira out of the cockpit with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and relief. The squadron commander's expression was complex: pride, amazement, and something that might have been awe, as she looked at the pilot who had just accomplished what seasoned combat veterans would have considered impossible. "Raven," Chen said quietly, her voice barely audible over the cooling sounds of the aircraft's systems. "That was—" She paused, searching for words adequate to describe what she had witnessed. "That was the finest display of combat flying I've ever seen. You saved American lives tonight through skill, courage, and judgment that redefined what I thought was possible in a single-seat fighter." Kira climbed down from the cockpit, her legs unsteady from the accumulated stress of 4 hours of high-intensity combat operations. The desert heat hit her like a physical blow after the air-conditioned environment of the aircraft, but she barely noticed. Her attention was focused on the faces surrounding her: pilots who had served multiple combat tours, maintenance personnel who had seen hundreds of aircraft return from missions, support staff who had witnessed the full spectrum of military aviation operations. What she saw in their expressions was something she had never expected to achieve: not just respect, but genuine admiration from professionals who understood exactly what they had witnessed. These people knew the difference between competent flying and extraordinary performance. They recognized the distinction between successful mission completion and tactical brilliance that saved lives through pure skill and determination. The debriefing took 6 hours and involved officers from every level of the chain of command. Intelligence analysts wanted detailed descriptions of enemy defensive positions and tactics. Operations planners needed to understand how a single aircraft had achieved objectives that had been allocated to an entire strike package. Senior commanders required assessments of enemy capabilities and recommendations for future operations in similar environments. But the most significant conversation occurred privately between Kira and Chen after the formal proceedings had concluded. They sat in the squadron commander's office, a sparse room dominated by mission planning materials and photographs of pilots who had served with distinction in previous conflicts. The air conditioning struggled against the desert heat, creating a constant background hum that underscored the isolation of their deployment environment. "Raven," Chen began, her tone indicating that this was a conversation between pilots rather than a formal military discussion. "What you accomplished tonight will have consequences beyond this mission. Word travels fast in our community, and performance like yours gets noticed at every level. You're going to have opportunities that most pilots never see, assignments that will challenge everything you think you know about military aviation. Kira considered this carefully, recognizing that her actions had indeed changed the trajectory of her career in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "Ma'am, I didn't volunteer for this mission to advance my career. I did it because American warriors were dying, and I had the capability to save them. Everything else is secondary to that responsibility." Chen nodded, unsurprised by the response but pleased by its sincerity. That attitude is exactly why you'll succeed in whatever assignments come next. But I want you to understand that success at higher levels requires different skills than pure flying ability. You'll need to learn leadership, strategy, and the kind of political awareness that keeps effective officers in positions where they can make a difference. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging across topics from tactical doctrine to career development, but always returning to the fundamental question of how individual excellence could be transformed into institutional effectiveness. Kira listened carefully, filing away insights that would prove invaluable in the years to come, but her mind kept returning to the voices on the radio, the SEAL team members who had counted on her precision and judgment to bring them home alive. That night, as she lay on her narrow bunk listening to the desert wind howl around the prefabricated buildings, Kira reflected on the events that had brought her to this moment. The mockery at flight training, the skepticism of her squadron mates, the gradual acceptance earned through consistent performance. All of it had been preparation for the 30 minutes of combat that had tested every aspect of her training and character. She thought about General Thornfield's dismissive comments and wondered if he would recognize the pilot she had become. She remembered Morrison's quiet confidence in her abilities and felt grateful for the mentorship that had helped shape her professional development. Most importantly, she considered the faces of the SEAL team members she had seen during the mission briefing, knowing that her actions had ensured they would return safely to their own families and loved ones. The recognition came swiftly and from unexpected sources. Within weeks of the mission, classified reports began circulating through special operations communities describing the unprecedented close air support that had saved an entire SEAL team from annihilation. The details were sanitized for security reasons, but the essential facts were clear. A single pilot had achieved tactical success against overwhelming odds through skill, courage, and split-second decision-making that redefined combat aviation excellence. The Navy SEALs, men who rarely acknowledged anyone outside their own community, began referring to Raven 7 with the kind of reverence they typically reserved for their own fallen heroes. Special operations commanders requested her specifically for missions requiring the highest levels of precision and reliability. Intelligence officers sought her input on enemy tactics and defensive capabilities. Most significantly, she began receiving assignment offers that would have been unthinkable for a pilot with her limited experience under normal circumstances. The assignment that changed everything came from a source that surprised even Chen: United States Special Operations Command, requesting Kira's transfer to a classified unit responsible for the most sensitive air support missions in 3 theaters of operation. The position required security clearances at the highest levels, tactical flexibility that bordered on improvisation, and the ability to operate independently in environments where traditional military support was unavailable or politically impossible. It was the kind of assignment that career military aviators spent decades hopping to receive: elite units, unlimited resources, and missions that directly impacted national security at the strategic level. But it also meant leaving behind the squadron relationships she had worked so hard to build and entering a world where her previous accomplishments would be starting points rather than culminating achievements. Chen delivered the news personally, her expression revealing mixed emotions about losing her most capable pilot to higher priority assignments. They met in the same office where they had discussed Kira's future after her first combat mission, but the dynamic had shifted subtly. The conversation was now between equals, experienced combat pilots discussing professional opportunities rather than a commander mentoring a developing aviator. Raven, this assignment will challenge everything you think you know about military operations, Chen explained, handing over the classified briefing materials that outline the new unit's mission parameters. You'll be working with people who exist in the shadows of official military structure, conducting operations that never appear in public records or official histories. Success is measured in lives saved and disasters prevented, not medals or promotions. Kira reviewed the documents carefully, noting the operational tempo, the geographic scope, and the level of autonomy granted to individual team members. It was exactly the kind of position she had unknowingly been preparing for since her first day of